the Luftwaffe was the aerial warfare branch of the German Wehrmacht during World War II. After the German Empire's World War I-era Army Air Force, the Luftstreitkräfte FTE, and the Kaiserliche Marine naval air units had been disbanded by May 1920 under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Luftwaffe was reformed on February 26, 1935 and grew to become one of the strongest, most doctrinally advanced, and most battle-experienced air forces in the world when World War II started in Europe in September 1939. After the defeat of the Third Reich, the Luftwaffe was disbanded in 1946. Luftwaffe is also the generic term in German-speaking countries for any national military aviation service, and the names of air forces in other countries are usually translated into German as Luftwaffe. However, Luftstreitkräfte FTE, or Air Armed Force, is also sometimes used as a translation of Air Force for post-World War I air arms, as it was used as the first word of the official German name of the former East German Air Force, disbanded the day before German reunification was achieved in October 1990. Since Luft translates into English as air, and Waffe may be translated into English as either weapon, or arm, air arm may be considered the most literal English translation of Luftwaffe. Origin: World War I. One of the forerunners of the Luftwaffe, the Imperial German Army Air Service, was founded in 1910 with the name Die Fliegertruppen des Deutschen Kaiserreiches, most often shortened to Fliegertruppe. It was renamed Luftstreitkräfte FTE by October 1916. The air war on the Western Front received the most attention in the annals of the earliest accounts of military aviation, since it produced aces such as Manfred von Richthofen, popularly known as the Red Baron, Ernst Udet, Oswald Boelk, Werner Voss, and Maxim Illmann, many of whom would later serve in the Luftwaffe, and Manfred von Richthofen's eventual successor to the command of JGI, Hermann Gar Paragraph Ring, the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief for most of its existence. After the defeat of Germany, the service was dissolved on May 8, 1920 under the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, which also mandated the destruction of all military aircraft of Germany. Interwar period. Since the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany to have an air force, German pilots trained in violation of the treaty in secret. Initially, civil aviation schools within Germany were used, yet only light trainers could be used in order to maintain the force Section A that the trainees were going to fly with civil airlines such as Deutsche Lufthansa. To train its pilots on the latest combat aircraft, Germany solicited the help of its future enemy, the Soviet Union, which was also isolated in Europe. A secret training airfield was established at Lipetsk in 1924 and operated for approximately 9 years using mostly Dutch and Russian, but also some German, training aircraft before being closed in 1933. This base was officially known as 4th Squadron of the 40th Wing of the Red Army. The first steps towards the Luftwaffe's formation were undertaken just months after Adolf Hitler came to power. Hermann Gar Paragraph Ring, a World War I ace with 22 victories and the holder of the Orden pour la Mar copyright right, became National Commissar for Aviation with former Deutsche Lufthansa director Erhard Milch as his deputy. In April 1933 the Reichsluftfahrtministerium was established. The RLM was in charge of development and production of aircraft, and soon afterwards the test site or Erprobungsstelle at Rechlin became its testing ground, a military airfield that had been first established in August 1918. Gar Paragraph Ring's control over all aspects of aviation became absolute. On March 25, 1933 the Deutschen Luftsportverband absorbed all private and national organizations, whilst retaining its sports title. The merging of all military aviation organizations in the RLM took place on May 15, 1933, which became the Luftwaffe's official birthday. Many members of the Nationalsozialistisches Fliegerkorps transferred to the Luftwaffe. As all such prior NSFK members were also Nazi Party members, this gave the new Luftwaffe a strong Nazi ideological base in contrast to the other branches of the German military. Gar Paragraph Ring had played a leading role in the build-up of the Luftwaffe in 1933–1936, but played little further part in the development of the Luftwaffe until 1936, and Milch became the de facto minister until 1937. The absence of GAR paragraph ring in planning and production matters was fortunate. GAR paragraph ring had little knowledge of current aviation, had last flown in 1922, and had not kept himself informed of latest events. GAR paragraph ring also displayed a lack of understanding of doctrine and technical issues in aerial warfare which he left to others more competent. The Commander-in-Chief left the organization and building of the Luftwaffe, after 1936, to Erhard Melch. However, GAR paragraph ring, as a part of Hitler's inner circle, was to provide enormous financial materials for rearming and equipping the Luftwaffe. Another prominent figure in German air power construction this time was Helmut Wilberg. Wilberg was to play a large role in the development of German air doctrine. Having headed the Reichswehr staff for 8 years in the 1920s, Wilberg had considerable experience and was ideal for a senior staff position. GAR paragraph ring considered making Wilberg Chief of Staff. However, it was revealed Wilberg had a Jewish mother. For that reason GAR paragraph ring could not have him as CS. Not wishing his talent to go to waste, GAR paragraph ring ensured the racial laws of the Third Reich did not apply to him. Wilberg remained in the air staff and helped draw up the principal doctrine, the conduct of the aerial war, and its Regulation 16 under Walther Wever. Preparing for war, 1933–1939, the Wever years, 1933–1936. Contrary to popular belief in American and British circles, the Luftwaffe was not the handmaiden of the German army. The German officer corps was keen to develop strategic bombing capabilities against its enemies. However, economic and geopolitical considerations had to take priority. The German air power theorists continued to develop strategic theories, but emphasis was given to army support, as Germany was a continental power and expected to face ground operations following any declaration of hostilities. For these reasons, between 1933 and 1934, the Luftwaffe's leadership was primarily concerned with tactical and operational methods. In aerial terms, the Army concept of Truppenfahrwann-Quartierung was an operational concept, as well as a tactical doctrine. In the First World War, air units had been attached to specific Army formations and acted as support. Dive bomber units were considered essential to Truppenfahrwann-Quartierung, destroying headquarters and lines of communications. Luftwaffe Regulation 10, the bomber, published in 1934, advocated air superiority and approaches to ground attack tactics without dealing with operational matters. Until 1935, the 1926 Manual Directives for the Conduct of the Operational Air War continued to act as the main guide for German air operations. The manual directed the OKL to focus on limited operations, the protection of specific areas and support of the Army in combat. With an effective tactical operational concept, the German air power theorists needed a strategic doctrine and organization. Robert Nourse, a serviceman in the Luftstreitkräfte FTE during the First World War, and later an experienced pilot with Lufthansa, was a prominent theorist of air power. Nourse promoted the Julio Douhet theory that air power could win wars alone by destroying enemy industry and morale by terrorizing the population of major cities. This advocated attacks on civilians. The General Staff blocked the entry of Douhet's theory into doctrine, fearing revenge strikes against German civilians and cities. In December 1934, Chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff Walther Wever sought to mold the Luftwaffe's battle doctrine into a strategic plan. At this time, Wever conducted war games in a bid to establish his theory of a strategic bombing force that would, he thought, prove decisive by winning the war through the destruction of enemy industry, even though these exercises also included tactical strikes against enemy ground forces and communications. In 1935, Luftwaffe Regulation 16, the conduct of the air war, was drawn up. In the proposal, it concluded, the mission of the Luftwaffe is to serve these goals. Within this doctrine, the Luftwaffe leadership rejected the practice of terror bombing. Terror bombing was deemed to be counterproductive, increasing rather than destroying the enemy's will to resist. Such bombing campaigns were regarded as diversion from the Luftwaffe's main operations. Destruction of the enemy armed forces. the bombings of Guernica, Rotterdam and Warsaw were considered tactical missions in support of military operations and were not intended as strategic terror attacks. Nevertheless, Weaver recognized the importance of strategic bombing. In newly introduced doctrine, the conduct of the aerial air war in 1935, Weaver rejected the theory of do it and outlined 5 key points to air strategy. 1. To destroy the enemy air force by bombing its bases and aircraft factories, and defeating enemy air forces attacking German targets. 2. To prevent the movement of large enemy ground forces to the decisive areas by destroying railways and roads, particularly bridges and tunnels, which are indispensable for the movement and supply of forces. 3. To support the operations of the army formations, independent of railways, that is, armored forces and motorized forces, by impeding the enemy advance and participating directly in ground operations. 4. To support naval operations by attacking naval bases, protecting Germany's naval bases and participating directly in naval battles. 5. To paralyze the enemy armed forces by stopping production in the armaments factories. Weaver began planning for a strategic bomber force and sought to incorporate strategic bombing into a war strategy. He believed that tactical aircraft should only be used as a step to developing a strategic air force. In May 1934, Weaver initiated a 7-year project for the Ural bomber, the bomber that would take the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign into the heart of the Soviet Union. In 1935, this led to the Dornier Do-19 and Junkers Ju-89 prototypes, although both were underpowered. In April 1936, Weaver ordered a requirement for bomber which would have a range of 6,700 km with a 900 kg bomb load. However, Weaver's vision of a Ural bomber was never realized, and his emphasis on strategic aerial operations was lost, with the only design submittal for Weaver's bomber that would reach production being Heinkel's Project 1041, which became officially known on November 5, 1937 as the Heinkel He-177. By the late 1930s the Luftwaffe had no clear purpose. The Air Force was not subordinated to the Army support role, and it was not given any particular strategic mission. German doctrine fell between the two concepts. The Luftwaffe was to be an organization capable of carrying out broad and general support tasks rather than any specific mission. Mainly, this path was chosen to encourage a more flexible use of air power and offer the ground forces the right conditions for a decisive victory. In fact, on the outbreak of war, only 15% of the Luftwaffe's aircraft was devoted to ground support operations, exposing a long-held myth that the Luftwaffe was designed for only tactical and operational missions. A change of direction, 1936–1937, Weaver's participation in the construction of the Luftwaffe came to an abrupt end on June 3, 1936 when he was killed along with his engineer in a Heinkel He-70 Blitz, ironically on the very day that his bomber a heavy bomber design competition was announced. After Weaver's death, Gar Paragraph-Ring began taking more of an interest in the appointment of Luftwaffe staff officers. Gar Paragraph-Ring appointed his successor Albert Kesselring as CS and Ernst Udet head the Reichsair Ministry Technical Office, although he was not a technical expert. Despite this, Udet was appointed to and helped change the Luftwaffe's tactical direction towards producing fast medium bombers that were to destroy enemy air power in the battle zone rather than through industrial bombing of its aviation production. Kesselring and Udet did not get on. During Kesselring's time as CS, 1936–1937, a power struggle developed between the two as Udet attempted to extend his own power within the Luftwaffe. Kesselring also had to contend with Gar Paragraph-Ring appointing yes men to positions of importance. Udet realized his limitations, and his failures in the production and development of German aircraft would have serious long-term consequences. The failure of the Luftwaffe to progress further towards attaining a strategic bombing force was attributable to several reasons. Many in the Luftwaffe command believed medium bombers to be sufficient power to launch strategic bombing operations against Germany's most likely enemies: France, Czechoslovakia and Poland. The United Kingdom presented greater problems. General der Flieger Helmuth Felmy, commander of Luftflotte II in 1939, was charged with devising a plan for an air war over the British Isles. Felmy was convinced that Britain could be defeated through morale bombing. Felmy noted the alleged panic that had broken out in London during the Munich crisis, evidence he believed of British weakness. A second reason was technical. German designers had never solved the issues of the Heinkel E-177A's design difficulties, brought on by the requirement from its inception on November 5, 1937 to have moderate dive bombing capabilities in a 30-meter wingspan class military aircraft. Moreover, Germany did not possess the economic strength and resources to match the later British and American effort of 1943–1944, particularly in large-scale mass production of high-power output aircraft power plants, those capable of a maximum output of at least 1,500 a kilowatt apiece. In addition, the OKL had not foreseen the industrial and military effort strategic bombing would require. By 1939 the Luftwaffe was not much better prepared than its enemies to conduct a strategic bombing campaign, with fatal results during the Battle of Britain. The German rearmament program faced difficulties acquiring raw materials. Germany imported most of its essential materials for rebuilding the Luftwaffe, in particular rubber and aluminium. Petroleum imports were particularly vulnerable to blockade. The Germans pushed for synthetic fuel plants, but still failed to meet demands. In 1937 Germany imported more fuel than it had at the start of the decade. By the summer 1938 only 25% of requirements could be covered. In steel materials, industry was operating at barely 83% and by November 1938 GAR paragraph Ring reported the economic situation was serious. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the overall command for all German military forces, ordered reductions in raw and steel materials for armament production. The figures for reduction were substantial: 30% steel, 20% copper, 47% aluminium and 14% rubber. Under such circumstances, it was not possible for Milch, Adet or Kesselring to produce a formidable strategic bombing force even had they wanted to do so. The development of aircraft was now confined to the production of twin-engined medium bombers that required much less material, manpower and aviation production capacity than Weaver's Ural bombers. German industry could build 2 medium bombers for 1 heavy bomber and the RLM would not gamble on developing a heavy bomber which would also take time. GAR paragraph Ring remarked, "The far one-quarter air will not ask how big the bombers there are, but only how many there are." The premature death of Weaver, one of the Luftwaffe's finest officers, left the Luftwaffe without a strategic air force during World War II, which eventually proved fatal to the German war effort. The lack of strategic capability should have been apparent much earlier. The Sudeten crisis highlighted German unpreparedness to conduct a strategic air war, and Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe be expanded by 5 times its earlier size. The OKL badly neglected the need for transport aircraft. Even in 1943, transport units were described as Kampfgeschwadron zur besonderen Verwendung and only grouping them together into dedicated cargo and personal transport wings during that year. In March 1938, as the Anschluss was taking place, GAR paragraph Ring ordered Felmy to investigate the prospect of air raids against Britain. Felmy concluded it was not possible until bases in Belgium and the Netherlands were obtained and the Luftwaffe had heavy bombers. Fortunately it mattered little, as the British betrayed the Czechs, war was avoided, and the need for long-range aircraft did not arise. These failures were not exposed until wartime. In the meantime German designs of mid-1930s origin such as the Messerschmitt Bf 109, Heinkel He 111, Junkers Ju 87 Stuka, and Dornier Do 17, performed very well. All first saw active service in the Condor Legion against Soviet-supplied aircraft. The Luftwaffe also quickly realized the days of the biplane fighter were finished, the Heinkel He-51 being switched to service as a trainer. Particularly impressive were the Heinkel and Dornier, which fulfilled the Luftwaffe's requirements for bombers that were faster than 1930s-era fighters. Many of which were biplanes or strut-braced monoplanes. Despite the participation of these aircraft, it was the venerable Junkers Ju 52 that made the main contribution. During the Spanish Civil War Hitler remarked, Franco ought to erect a monument to the glory of the Junkers Ju-52. It is the aircraft which the Spanish Revolution has to thank for its victory. Dive bombing, poor accuracy from level bombers in 1937 led the Luftwaffe to grasp the benefits of dive bombing. The latter could achieve far better accuracy against small mobile tactical targets than heavier, conventional bombers. Range was not key criteria for these tasks, and it was not always viable for the Army to move heavy artillery over recently captured territory to bombard fortifications or support ground forces when faster dive bombers could do the job more quickly. Dive bombers, often single-engine two-man machines, could achieve better results than larger 6- or 7-man aircraft, at a tenth of the cost and 4 times the accuracy. This led to Ernst Udet championing the dive bomber, particularly the Junkers Ju-87. Udet's love affair with dive bombing seriously affected the long-term development of the Luftwaffe, especially after General Weaver's untimely death. The tactical strike aircraft programs were meant to serve as interim solutions until the next generation of aircraft arrived. In 1936 the Junkers Ju-52 was the backbone of the German bomber fleet. This led to a rush on the part of the URLM to produce the Junkers Ju-86, Heinkel He-111 and Dornier Do-17 before a proper evaluation was made. The Ju-86 was poor while the He-111 showed most promise. The Spanish Civil War convinced Udet that wastage was not acceptable in munition terms. Udet sought to build dive bombing into the Junkers Ju-88 and conveyed the same idea, initiated specifically by the OKL for the Heinkel He-177, approved in early November 1937. In the case of the Ju-88, 50,000 modifications had to be made. The weight was increased from 7 to 12 tons. This resulted in a speed loss of 200 km per hour. Udet merely conveyed the OKL's own dive bombing capability request to Ernst Heinkel concerning the He-177, who vehemently opposed such an idea, which ruined its development as a heavy bomber. GAR paragraph Ring was not able to rescind the dive bombing requirement for the He-177A until September 1942. Mobilization, 1938 to Euro 1941. By the summer of 1939, the Luftwaffe had 9 Jagdgeschwader mostly equipped with the Messerschmitt Bf-109E, 4 Zuster paragraph Geschwader equipped with the Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighter, 11 Kampfgeschwader equipped with mainly the Heinkel He-111 and the Dornier Do-17Z. And as it had encountered design difficulties, was just starting to accept the Junkers Ju-88A for service with only a dozen aircraft of the type considered combat-ready, and 4 Sturzkampfgeschwader ready for combat, primarily armed with the iconic Junkers Ju-87B Stuka. The Luftwaffe's strength at this time stood at 373,000 personnel. Aircraft strength was 4,201 operational aircraft. 1,191 bombers, 361 dive bombers, 788 fighters, 431 heavy fighters, and 488 transports. Despite deficiencies, it was an impressive force. However, even by the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe still had not mobilized fully. Despite the shortage of raw materials, Generaloffizier Ernst Udet had increased production through introducing a 10-hour working day for aviation industries and rationalizing of production. During this period 30 Kampfstaffeln and 16 Jagdstaffeln were being raised and equipped. A further 5 Zusterregruppen were created, all equipped with the Bf-110. The Luftwaffe also greatly expanded its aircrew training programs by 42%, to 63 flying schools. These facilities were moved to eastern Germany, away from possible Allied threats. The number of aircrew reached 4,727, an increase of 31%. However, the rush to complete this rapid expansion scheme resulted in the deaths of 997 personnel and another 700 wounded. 946 aircraft were also destroyed in these accidents. The number of aircrew completing their training was up to 3,941, the Luftwaffe's entire strength was now 2.2 million personnel. From 1920s to 1941, hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots and technical personnel visited, studied and were trained in the Soviet Union at Soviet Air Force schools in several locations in central Russia. Gar Paragraph-ing was at these Russian Air Force training schools several times during the 1930s. He flew Russian airplanes, had a Russian girlfriend and was engaged in numerous drinking parties while living in a suburb of Lipetsk. Roessing, Blum, Voss, Tietzemann, Haney, Makritsky, Blumendaut and many other Luftwaffe aces were trained in Russia in joint Russian-German schools that were set up under patronage of Ernst August Karl Paragraph-String. German-Soviet collaboration was facilitated, besides Gar Paragraph-Ring, by Brauchitsch, Guderian, Model, Keitel, Kraus, Adam, and Manstein, all of whom studied and visited Soviet Russia prior to the beginning of World War II. In April and May 1941, Audit headed the Luftwaffe delegation inspecting Soviet aviation industry in compliance with the Milosevic-Ribbentrop Pact. Audit informed Gar Paragraph-Ring that Soviet air forces are very strong and technically advanced. Gar Paragraph-Ring decided not to report the facts to Hitler, hoping that a surprise attack will quickly destroy Russia. Audit realized that the upcoming war on Russia may cripple Germany. Audit, torn between truth and loyalty, suffered a psychological breakdown and even tried to tell all the truth to Hitler, but Gar Paragraph-Ring told Hitler that Audit was lying, then took Audit under control by giving him drugs at drinking parties and hunting trips. Audit's drinking and psychological condition became a problem, but Gar Paragraph-Ring used Audit's dependency to manipulate him. Luftwaffe Organization. Luftwaffe commanders. Throughout the history of the Third Reich, the Luftwaffe had only two commanders-in-chief. The first was Hermann Gar Paragraph-Ring, with the second and last being General Field Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim. His appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe was concomitant with his promotion to General Field Marshal, the last German officer in World War II to be promoted to the highest rank. Other officers promoted to the second highest military rank in Germany were Albert Kesselring, Hugo Spell, Erhard Milch, and Wolfram von Richthofen. At the end of the war, with Berlin surrounded by the Red Army, Gar Paragraph-Ring sent a telegram to Hitler suggesting he take over leadership of the Reich. Hitler interpreted this as an ultimatum and coup. Hitler ordered his arrest and execution. Gar Paragraph-Ring's SS guards did not carry out the order and he was arrested by the United States Army in Bavaria on May 9, 1945. Gar Paragraph-Ring was prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials after the war. The indictments were for participation in a common plan or conspiracy for the accomplishment of a crime against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression and other crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death by hanging. He appealed to the court requesting to be shot as a soldier. The court refused. However, Gar Paragraph-Ring defied the sentence and committed suicide by taking potassium cyanide. Spell was prosecuted at the OKW trial, one of the last 12 of the Nuremberg trials after the war. He was acquitted on all 4 counts of all charges. He died in Munich in 1953. Organization and chain of command. At the start of the war the Luftwaffe had 4 Luftflotten, each responsible for roughly a quarter of Germany. As the war progressed more air fleets were created as the areas under German rule expanded. As one example, Luftflotte 5 was created in 1940 to direct operations in Norway and Denmark, and other Luftflotten were created as necessary. Each Luftflotte would contain several Fliegerkorps, Fliegerdivision, Jagdkorps, Jagddivision or Jagdleiterfahr 1/4 Air. Each formations would have attached to it a number of units, usually several Geschwader, but also independent Staffeln and Kampfgruppen. Luftflotten were also responsible for the training aircraft and schools in their operational areas. A Geschwader was commanded by a Geschwader Commodore, with the rank of either Major, Oberstleutnant or Oberst. Other staff officers within the unit with administrative duties included the adjutant, technical officer, and operations officer, who were usually experienced aircrew or pilots still flying on operations. Other specialist staff were navigation, signals and intelligence personnel. A Stay Schwarm was attached to each Geschwader. Jagdgeschwader were single-seat day fighter Geschwaders, typically equipped with Bf-109 or Fw-190 aircraft flying in the fighter or fighter-bomber roles. It consisted of groups, which in turn consisted of Jagdstaffel. Hence, Fighter Wing 1 was JG-1, its first group was I/JG-1, using a Roman numeral for the group number only, and its first Staffel was 1/JG-1. Geschwader's strength was usually 120-125 aircraft. Each group was commanded by a commander, and a Staffel by a Staffelkapitän. However, these were appointments, not ranks, within the Luftwaffe. Usually, the Commodore would hold the rank of Oberstleutnant or, exceptionally, an Oberst. Even a lieutenant could find himself commanding a Staffel. Similarly, a bomber wing was a Kampfgeschwader, a night fighter wing was a Nachtjagdgeschwader, NJG, a dive bomber wing was a Streitkräfte, and units equivalent to those in the RAF Coastal Command, with specific responsibilities for coastal patrols and search and rescue duties, were K-1 Quartersternfliegergruppen. Specialist bomber groups were known as Kampfgruppen. The strength of Geschwader was about 80-90 aircraft. Spanish Civil War. The Luftwaffe's Condor Legion experimented with new doctrine and aircraft during the Spanish Civil War. It helped the Falange under Francisco Franco to defeat the Republican forces. Over 20,000 German airmen gained combat experience that would give the Luftwaffe an important advantage going into the Second World War. One infamous operation was the bombing of Guernica in the Basque Country. It is commonly assumed this attack was the result of a terror doctrine in Luftwaffe doctrine. The effects of the raids on Guernica and Madrid caused many civilian casualties and a wave of protests in the democracies. It has been suggested that the bombing of Guernica was carried out for military tactical reasons, in support of ground operations, but the town was not directly involved in any fighting at that point in time. It was not until 1942 that the Germans started to develop bombing policy in which civilians were the primary target, although the Blitz on London and many other British cities involved indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, known as nuisance raids, which could even involve the machine gunning of civilians and livestock. Second World War. When the Second World War began, the Luftwaffe was one of the most technologically advanced air forces in the world. During the Polish campaign that triggered the war, it established air superiority, and then air supremacy, quickly. It supported German army operations which ended the campaign in 5 weeks. The Luftwaffe's performance was as the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe had hoped. The Luftwaffe had rendered invaluable support to the army, mopping up pockets of resistance. Gar Paragraph Ring was delighted with the performance. Command and control problems were experienced, but owing to the flexibility and improvisation of both the Army and Luftwaffe, these problems were solved. The Luftwaffe was to have in place a ground-to-air communication system, which played a vital role in the success of Fallgelb. In the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe assisted the Kriegsmarine and Heer in the daring invasion of Norway, Operation Weser 1/4 Bung. Flying in reinforcements and winning air superiority, the Luftwaffe contributed decisively to the German conquest and expulsion of the Western Allies from Scandinavia. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe contributed to the unexpected success in the Battle of France. It helped destroy 3 Allied air forces and secure the defeat of France in just over 6 weeks. However, during the Battle of Dunkirk, despite intense bombing, it could not deliver Gar Paragraph Ring's promise to destroy the British Expeditionary Force, which escaped to continue the war. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe, despite causing severe damage to the Royal Air Force's infrastructure and British cities during the subsequent Blitz, did not achieve the air superiority that Hitler demanded for Operation Sea Lion as the invasion was cancelled in December 1940, when Hitler ordered preparations to be made for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The following spring, the Luftwaffe helped its Axis partner, Italy, secure victory in the Balkans campaign and continued to support the Italians in the Mediterranean, Middle East and African theaters until May 1945. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft. But it failed to destroy the Red Air Force. Due to a lack of strategic bombers, the very Ural bombers that General Weaver had asked for 6 years before, the Luftwaffe could not strike at Soviet production centers regularly or with the needed force. As the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe was eroded in strength. The defeats at the Battle of Stalingrad and Battle of Kursk ensured the gradual decline of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. British historian Frederick Taylor asserts that all sides bombed each other's cities during the war. 500,000 Soviet citizens, for example, died from German bombing during the invasion and occupation of Russia. That's roughly equivalent to the number of German citizens who died from Allied raids. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe continued to defend Germany-occupied Europe against the growing offensive power of RAF Bomber Command and, starting in the summer of 1942, the steadily building strength of the United States Army Air Forces. The defense of the Reich campaign gradually destroyed the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Despite its belated use of advanced turbojet and rocket-propelled aircraft for bomber-destroyer duties, it was overwhelmed by Allied numbers and a lack of trained pilots and fuel. A last-ditch attempt, known as Operation Bodenplatte, to win air superiority on January 1, 1945 failed. After the Bodenplatte effort, the Luftwaffe had ceased to be an effective fighting force. Omissions and failures, mistakes in command, the lack of aerial defense, the failure of the Luftwaffe in the defense of the Reich campaign was a result of a number of factors. The Luftwaffe lacked an effective air defense system early in the war. Adolf Hitler's foreign policy had pushed Germany into war before these defenses could be fully developed. The Luftwaffe was forced to improvise and construct its defenses during the war. The daylight actions over German-controlled territory were sparse in 1939–1940. The responsibility of the defense of German airspace fell to the Luftkorps commandos. The defense systems relied mostly on the flak arm. The defenses were not coordinated and communication was poor. This lack of understanding between the flak and flying branches of the defense would plague the Luftwaffe throughout the war. Hitler in particular wanted the defense to rest on anti-aircraft artillery as it gave the civilian population a psychological crutch no matter how ineffective the weapons. Most of the battles fought by the Luftwaffe on the Western Front would be against the RAF's circus raids and the occasional daylight raid into German airspace. This was a fortunate position since the Luftwaffe's strategy of focusing its striking power on one front started to unravel with the failure of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The peripheral strategy of the Luftwaffe between 1939 and 1940 had been to deploy its fighter defenses at the edges of Axis-occupied territory, with little protecting the inner depths. Moreover, the frontline units in the West were complaining about the poor numbers and performance of aircraft. Units complained of lack of paragraph rare aircraft with all-weather capabilities and the lack of climbing power of the Bf-109. The Luftwaffe's technical edge was slipping as the only formidable new aircraft in the German arsenal was the Focke-Wulf Fw-190. General Field Marshal Erhard Milch was to assist Ernst Udet with aircraft production increases and introduction of more modern types of fighter aircraft. However, they explained at a meeting of the Reich Industrial Council on September 18, 1941 that the new next-generation aircraft had failed to materialize, and obsolescent types had to be continued to keep up with the growing need for replacements. The build-up of the Jagdwaffe was too rapid and its quality suffered. It was not put under a unified command until 1943, which also affected performance. Of the 9 Jagdgeschwader fighter wings in existence in 1939, no further units were formed until 1942, and the years of 1940–1941 were wasted. The Oberkommando der Luftwaffe failed to construct a strategy, instead its command style was reactionary, and its measures not as effective without thorough planning. This was particularly apparent with the Fw-190-equipped stern box squadrons which were armed with heavy 20 and 30 cannon to destroy heavy bombers, to replace the increasingly ineffective twin-engine paragraph rare twin-engined heavy fighter wings, initially tasked with being the Luftwaffe's primary bomber-destroyer forces to repel USAAF daylight raids. This increase in weight affected the performance of the FW-190 and Bf-109 at a time when the two aircraft were meeting large numbers of equal if not superior Allied types. Mistakes in development and equipment. In terms of technological development, the failure to develop a long-range bomber and capable long-range fighters during this period left the Luftwaffe unable to conduct a meaningful, strategic bombing campaign throughout the war. However, Germany at that time suffered from limitations in raw materials such as oil and aluminium, which meant that there were insufficient resources for much beyond a tactical air force. Given these circumstances, the Luftwaffe's reliance on tactical mid-range, twin-engined medium bombers and short-range dive bombers was a pragmatic choice of strategy. It might also be argued that the Luftwaffe's Kampfgeschwader medium and heavy bomber wings were perfectly capable of attacking strategic targets, but the lack of capable long-range escort fighters which, in most respects, were what the Zesta paragraph rare heavy fighters were meant to be left the bombers unable to carry out their missions effectively against determined and well-organized fighter opposition. The greatest failure for the Kampfgeschwader, however, was being saddled with an aircraft intended to be as big and as apparently capable as any Allied four-engined heavy bomber the perpetually troubled Heinkel He-177, condemned through being designed to carry out moderate-angle dive bombing missions from the day that the URLM accepted it for production in November 1937, so making it overweight from the start, and mandating design features that meant its welded-together engines, a pair of cumbersome Daimler-Benz DB606 power systems, were prone to catch fire in flight during operational missions over both the Eastern Front and the United Kingdom. Of the three parallel proposals from the Heinkel engineering departments for a true four-engined version of the A-series He-177, only one of them, the He-177B, emerged in the concluding months of 1943, with only three airworthy prototypes produced by early 1944, some 3 years after the first flights of the Avro-Lancaster's own prototypes. The most commonly encountered RAF heavy bomber pounding Germany on strategic night raids from 1942 to the end of the war in Europe. Another failure of procurement and equipment was a lack of a dedicated naval air arm. General Felmy had already expressed a desire to build a naval air arm to support Kriegsmarine operations in the Atlantic and British waters. Britain was dependent on food and raw materials from its empire and North America. Felmy pressed this case firmly throughout 1938 and 1939, and, on October 31, 1939, Groen Admiral Erich Roeder sent a strongly worded letter to Gar Paragraph Ring in support of such proposals. The early war twin-engined Heinkel He-115 Float plane and Dornier Do-18 flying boat were too slow and short-ranged, with the then-contemporary Blochmann Voss BV-138 Tremotor flying boat becoming the Luftwaffe's primary maritime patrol platform, with nearly 300 examples built and capable of up to a 4,300 km range from its trio of Junkers Jumo 205 diesel engines. Another Blochmann Voss design of 1940, the enormous six-engine Blochmann Voss BV-222 Viking maritime patrol flying boat, would see it capable of a 6,800 km range at maximum endurance when using higher output versions of the same Jumo 205 power plants as used by the BV-138, in later years. The Dornier Do 217 would have been ideal, but suffered production problems. Roeder also complained about the poor standard of aerial torpedoes, although their design was the Kriegsmarine's responsibility, even considering production of the Japanese Type 91 torpedo used at Pearl Harbor as the Lufttorpedo LT-850 by 1942. Without specialized naval or maritime patrol aircraft, the Luftwaffe was forced to improvise. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor airliner's airframe engineered for civilian airliner use made it unsuitable as a bomber, lacking speed, armor and bomb load capacity. Nevertheless, this civilian transport was adapted to the long-range reconnaissance and anti-shipping roles and, between August 1940 and February 1941, FW-200 sank 85 vessels for a claimed total of 363,000 GRT. Had the Luftwaffe focused on naval aviation, particularly maritime patrol aircraft with long range, Like the aforementioned diesel-powered multi-engine Blochmann Voss flying boats, Germany might well have been in a position to win the Battle of the Atlantic. However, Roeder and the Navy failed to press for naval air power until the war began, mitigating the Luftwaffe's responsibility. In addition, Gar Paragraph Ring regarded any other branch of the German military developing its own aviation as an encroachment on his authority and continually frustrated the Navy's attempts to build its own air power. The absence of a strategic bomber force for the Luftwaffe, following General Weaver's accidental death in 1936 and the end of the Ural bomber program he fostered before the invasion of Poland, would not be addressed again until the authorization of the Bomber B design competition in July 1939, which sought to replace the medium bomber force with which the Luftwaffe was to begin the war, with more advanced, twin-engined high-speed bomber aircraft fitted with pairs of relatively high-power engines of 1,500 kilowatt output levels and upwards each, that would also be able to function as shorter-range heavy bombers. The spring 1942 America bomber program also sought to produce useful strategic bomber designs for the Luftwaffe, with their prime design priority being an advanced transoceanic range capability as the main aim of the project to directly attack the United States from Europe or the Azores. Inevitably, both the Bomber B and America bomber programs were victims of the continued emphasis of the Wehrmacht's insistence for the Luftwaffe to support the Army as its primary mission, as well as the increasingly devastating results of the RAF Bomber Command at night, and by 1943 the USAAF's 8th and 15th Air Force's heavy bomber raids by daylight on the German aviation industry, which catastrophically diminished the Third Reich's overall aviation production capacity later in World War II. The RLM's apparent lack of a dedicated technical-tactical department, that would have directly been in contact with combat pilots to assess their needs for weaponry upgrades and tactical advice, had never been seriously envisioned as a critically ongoing necessity in the planning of the original German air arm. The RLM did have its own Technischamt department to handle aviation technology issues, but this was tasked with handling all aviation technology issues in the Third Reich, both military and civilian in nature, and also not known to have ever had any clear and actively administrative and consultative links with the frontline forces established for such purposes. On the frontline combat side of the issue, and for direct contact with the German aviation firms making the Luftwaffe's warplanes, the Luftwaffe did have its own reasonably effective system of 4 military aviation test facilities, or Übungsstellen located at 3 coastal sites: European EMA 1/4 NDE West, Tannewitz and Travemar 1/4 NDE Euro, and the central inland site of Rechlin, itself first established as a military airfield in late August 1918 by the German Empire, with the 4-facility system commanded later in World War II by Oberst Edgar Peterson. As a result of the lack of coordination between the RLM Ministry and the OKL, all fighter and bomber development was oriented toward short-range aircraft, as they could be produced in greater numbers, rather than quality long-range aircraft, something that put the Luftwaffe at a disadvantage as early as the Battle of Britain. Production was also slow, not reaching maximum output until 1944. Production of fighters was not given priority until 1944. Adolf Galland commented that this should have occurred at least a year earlier. Galland also points to the mistakes and challenges made in the development of the Me-262 Jetta Euro, which included the protracted development time required for its Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines to improve their reliability Euro, meaning that the Me-262A fighter variants could have entered service before the end of 1943 had such challenges been overcome, when the outcome of the air war was still in doubt, from events such as the disastrous losses to the U.S. 8th Air Force from the Black Thursday raid in mid-October of 1943. Types that were obsolete were kept in production for far too long, in particular the Ju-87 Stuka, and the Bf-109. Production failures. The failure of German production was evident from the start of the Battle of Britain. By the end of 1940 the Luftwaffe had suffered heavy losses and needed to regroup. Deliveries of new aircraft were insufficient to meet the drain on resources. The Luftwaffe, unlike the RAF, was failing to expand its pilot and aircraft numbers. This was partly owing to production planning failures before the war and the demands of the Army. Nevertheless, the German aircraft industry was being outproduced in 1940. In terms of fighter aircraft production, the British exceeded their production plans by 43%, while the Germans remained 40% behind target by the summer 1940. In fact, German production in fighters fell from 227 to 177 per month between July and September 1940. One of the many reasons for the failure of the Luftwaffe in 1940 was that it did not have the operational and material means to destroy the British aircraft industry. No effort was made to address the low production output of the German aviation industry to support the expected increased attrition rates. The so-called GAR paragraphing program envisaged the defeat of the Soviet Union in 1941. Erhard Milch's reforms expanded production rates. In 1941 an average of 981 aircraft were produced each month. In 1942 this rose to 1,296 aircraft, of which 434 were fighters. Milch's planned production increases were initially opposed. But in June, he was granted materials for 900 fighters per month as the average output. By the winter of 1941–1942 just 39% of the fighter force was operational and possessed just 60 more combat aircraft than it did in June 1941 despite its increased commitments. Throughout 1942 the Luftwaffe was outproduced in fighter aircraft by 250% and in twin-engine aircraft by 196%. The appointment of Albert Speer as Minister of Armaments increased production. However, the intensification of Allied bombing caused the dispersion of production and prevented an efficient acceleration of expansion. The German aviation production reached about 36,000 combat aircraft for 1944. However, by the time this was achieved the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel and trained pilots to make this achievement worthwhile. The failure to maximize production immediately after the failures in the Soviet Union and North Africa ensured the Luftwaffe's effective defeat in the period of September 1943–February 1944. Despite the tactical victories won, they failed to achieve a decisive victory. By the time production reached acceptable levels, as so many other factors had for the Luftwaffe and for the entire Wehrmacht as a whole late in the war, it was too little too late. Mistakes in pilot selection and training, the bomber arm was given preference and received the better pilots. Later, fighter pilot leaders were few in numbers as a result of this. As with the late shift to fighter production, the Luftwaffe pilot schools did not give the fighter pilot schools preference soon enough. The Luftwaffe, the OKW argued, was still an offensive weapon, and its primary focus was on producing bomber pilots. This attitude prevailed until the second half of 1943. During the defense of the Reich campaign in 1943 and 1944, there were not enough commissioned fighter pilots and leaders to meet attrition rates. As the need arose to replace aircrew, the quality of pilot training deteriorated rapidly. Later this was made worse by fuel shortages for pilot training. Overall this meant a fall on training on operational types, formation flying, gunnery training, combat training and a total lack of instrument training. Mistakes in leadership. At the beginning of the war commanders were replaced with younger commanders too quickly. These younger commanders had to learn in the field rather than entering a post fully qualified. Training of formation leaders was not systematical until 1943, which was far too late, with the Luftwaffe already stretched. The Luftwaffe thus lacked a cadre of staff officers to set up, man, and pass on experience. Moreover, Luftwaffe leadership from the start poached the training command, which undermined its ability to replace losses, while also planning for short sharp campaigns, which did not pertain. Moreover, no plans were laid for night fighters. In fact, when protests were raised, Jeschonnek himself said, "First we've got to beat Russia, then we can start training." Luftwaffe ground forces. One of the unique characteristics of the Luftwaffe was the possession of an organic paratrooper force called Volkssturmgekurrency. These were established in 1938. They saw action in their proper role during 1940–1941, most notably in the capture of the Belgian Army fortress at the Battle of Fort Ebenemael and the Battle for The Hague in May 1940, and during the Battle of Crete in May 1941. However, more than 4,000 Fallschirmjäger were killed during the Crete operation. Afterwards, although continuing to be trained in parachute delivery, paratroopers were only used in a parachute role for smaller-scale operations, such as the successful rescue of Benito Mussolini, the then-deposed dictator of Italy in 1943. Fallschirmjäger formations were then used as crackfoot infantry in all theaters of the war. During 1942, surplus Luftwaffe personnel was used to form the Luftwaffe field divisions, standard infantry divisions that were used chiefly as rear echelon units to free up frontline troops. From 1943, the Luftwaffe also had an armored paratroop division called Fallschirmpanzer Division 1 Hermann Paragraph Ring, which was expanded to a Panzerkorps in 1944. War crimes. Throughout the war, civilians or prisoners were used as human guinea pigs in testing Luftwaffe equipment. It is unclear whether these tests were carried out by Luftwaffe personnel or on the orders of OKL. These illegal tests are classified as war crimes and were carried out on the Luftwaffe's behalf. Human experimentation in military aviation. In 1941, experiments with the intent of discovering means to prevent and treat hypothermia were carried out. Freezing hypothermia experiments were conducted for the Nazi High Command to simulate the conditions the armies suffered on the Eastern Front, as the German forces were ill-prepared for the cold weather they encountered. The principal locales were Dachau and Auschwitz. Dr. Sigmund Rascher, an SS doctor based at Dachau, reported directly to Reich for 1/4 SS Heinrich Himmler and publicized the results of his freezing experiments at the 1942 medical conference entitled Medical Problems Arising from Sea and Winter. Approximately 100 people are reported to have died as a result of these experiments. In early 1942, prisoners at Dachau concentration camp were used by Rascher in experiments to perfect ejection seats at high altitudes. A low-pressure chamber containing these prisoners was used to simulate conditions at altitudes of up to 20,000 am. It was rumored that Rascher performed vivisections on the brains of victims who survived the initial experiment. Of the 200 subjects, 80 died outright, and the others were executed. See also, Organization of the Luftwaffe, Military ranks of Luftwaffe, List of flags of Luftwaffe, Uniforms and insignia of the Luftwaffe, German air fleets in World War II, List of World War II military aircraft of Germany, Eurobomber, Schnellbomber, Bomber B America Bomber, Luftwaffe serviceable aircraft strengths, Trial of Erhard Milch, High Command Trial, List of World War II aces from Germany, List of German World War II jet aces, List of German World War II ground attack aces, List of German World War II night fighter aces, German war crimes, bombing of Guernica, Nazi human experimentation, doctor's trial. Stalag Luft 3 murders, references, notes. Citations. Bibliography. External links, Traditionsgemeinschaft JG 52, Graf and Greislowski, Air War over the Eastern Front, the Pre-Normandy Air Battle, Losing Air Superiority a case study from World War II. Lieutenant Colonel Gunzinger Air Power as a Second Front a PDF file, forum discussion on reasons for Luftwaffe defeat in Bob, Davis, R. General Spaatz and D-Day, Andrews, W.F. The Luftwaffe and the Battle for Air Superiority PDF file, Hayward, J.S. Stalingrad an examination of Hitler's decision to airlift, Carter, W. Air Power in the Battle of the Bulge, I Biblio Hyperwar the Air War over Europe, Bomber Command War Diary Online, USAF Historical Research Agency at Maxwell AFB, Book Review of American Raiders discusses some of the Luftwaffe secrets captured at the end of the war. German article on Operation Paperclip, German wartime newsreel, showing dogfighting Luftwaffe fighters, 1942 on YouTube, the Luftwaffe 1933 1945, Book Strategy for Defeat of the Luftwaffe 1933 1945, The Luftwaffe over Germany by Donald Caldwell, Richard Muller Details of GAR Paragraph Rings Rant for Heavy Bombers. The Second World War, Europe and the Mediterranean by Thomas B. Bell, Thomas E. Grease, John H. Bradley, Jack W. Dice, of the Third Reich, Men of the Luftwaffe in World War II by Samuel W. Mitchum, Jr. Luftwaffe 39-45.